Okay, so as we get ready to see the post, I'd like to offer a quick history lesson to give you a little bit of background on the times and on the people who were involved. The film takes place in 1971, and in the context of the era, the late 70s, the early 70s, the late 60s, the U.S. had been involved in Vietnam secretly since the late 1950s and overtly since the mid 1960s. At the end of 1970, there were 350,000 troops in Vietnam fighting the war. In the previous 5 years, 54,483 had been killed. And you can put that in context. Over those 5 years, 54,000 soldiers have been killed. In Afghanistan and Iraq, over the course of 17 years, 8,398 soldiers were killed, including a Nora alum. Much of the public in the late 60s, early 70s had turned against the war. There were a lot of protests. At this point, also, most business was run by white men. Previously, a couple years earlier, during the 1968 election season, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, and a few months before that, Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. So there was a period of a great deal of turmoil. In terms of the people involved, Lyndon Johnson became president when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. At that point, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam was still pretty covert. But he does continue the war, and he actually escalates it, particularly around 1965. He keeps Kennedy's cabinet after the assassination, including a key player in this movie, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The war is so controversial that in 1968, during the primaries, he withdraws from consideration as re-election due to the war. Robert McNamara had been picked by John F. Kennedy to be the Secretary of Defense. Previously, he had been the CEO of the Ford Motor Company, brought an analytical mind to the Defense Department, thought things could be measured by numbers. He really was the architect of the Vietnam War policy through much of the 1960s. He's a friend, and he and his wife socialize with Catherine and Philip Graham, who will come up a little bit later. They are the owners and publishers of the Washington Post. During his time as Secretary of Defense in the mid to late 60s, he commissions a secret report on the United States involvement in Vietnam, which had started in the mid 1940s, and the report runs up to 1967 when he was still Secretary of Defense. Richard Nixon gets elected in 1968. He promises to bring an end to the Vietnam War. The war, however, does continue until 1973 with many more casualties. One of the things Nixon's very concerned about is leaks of sensitive information, one piece of which was his involvement before the election in holding off South Vietnam peace talks so that the Democrat wouldn't be elected. He creates a plumbers unit to try to find the leaks. The Pentagon Papers, the secret report on Vietnam, is the first leak that he's trying to plug. These plumbers later get involved in Watergate. John Mitchell is the Attorney General under Richard Nixon. It's his job to prosecute the leakers. He winds up later going to prison over the Watergate cover-up. The Washington Post, Catherine Graham is the owner and publisher, CEO of the Washington Post. Her grandfather had owned the paper. He passed it on to his father, her father, who also owned the paper. And when her father was ready to retire, instead of passing the paper on to his only child, Catherine Graham, he passed it on to her husband, who was his son-in-law. Really, at that point, no thought of passing on a powerful position like this to a woman. Catherine's husband, Philip Graham, died of suicide in the early 1960s. She inherits the paper, and in 1971, when the movie's taking place, she's taking the company public by selling stock. So it will no longer be just a small family-held paper as a way of raising money to expand what the paper is able to do. She is friends with Robert McNamara, who had been the Secretary of Defense, and his wife, who was quite ill during the course of this movie. Also at the Post, Ben Bradlee. He's the editor of the Washington Post. Earlier, in the early 1960s, he had been a reporter at Newsweek, and during that time, he had socialized with the Kennedys. Daniel Ellsberg worked at the Pentagon and later became an analyst at the Rand Corporation. During his travels to Vietnam, we'll see a little bit of this in the film. he becomes disillusioned with what is publicly being said about the war versus what the Secretary of Defense and the generals are saying privately about the war. While he's at the Rand Corporation, he has access to the secret report, which comes to be known as the Pentagon Papers, which is the secret history of the American involvement in Vietnam. First, he leaks the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, which is really the big rival to the Washington Post. The New York Times is a national newspaper, very powerful. The Washington Post would like to be as powerful and as well known as the New York Times. So here are some things to watch for in the movie. The role of women in business 50 years ago. If you look at this picture, you can see one thing is not like the others. This is Katharine Graham and the board of directors of the Washington Post. The board of directors of the Washington Post does look somewhat different today. Notice how women are treated socially, especially at the end of the dinner party scene, where the men go in one direction and the women in another, even though she is a business owner, the CEO. Just kind of watch the dynamic there. Notice also the conflict between what people have to do professionally and their personal lives. What happens when there's a conflict between the people you socialize with, the people you're friends with, and your professional duty to report on them or to deal with them in a professional way. Likewise, the conflict between one's professional obligations and financial obligations. What's the problem when you have a professional duty to do one thing and yet it may hurt you financially or hurt your company financially? Notice again the legality of publishing secrets, how the First Amendment gets involved, and how the government tries to cover up mistakes. So I hope this gives you a little bit puts the film in context and helps you appreciate the characters in the film and in real life, what they had to struggle with. I hope that you also see the connections to the realities of government and the relationship of the government and the press today, and how much society has changed in the last 50 years, even if there's still a long way to go.